Hi. So 3D modeling on computers, digitally creating a model in 3D space to render out onto a 2D result as an image is something that has a lot of background to it. And it's pretty amazing to think if you've seen some early 3D work, how you have these things called polygons. They're the faces of the 3D models. And you may have seen these things that look like cubes and shapes. And you might wonder, how do you get from that to these really nice, smooth looking surfaces that you might see in something like Pixar movies or other modern animated movies and effects? And there's a bunch of different ways to get there, but one key innovation in all of this is something called subdivision surfaces. This use of subdividing the simple polygons into something that looks completely smooth. It's a bit of a trick, and it's super, super useful. So I'm Aaron. This is Aaron Tinkers. Let's tinker with subdivision on polygons. I've opened up Maya here. I'm going to keep this pretty much 3D modeling program agnostic, but if you happen to have Maya laying around and you want to follow along, you'll be able to. I'll keep it pretty clear, hopefully. And I'm going to keep it also very simple. So if you have Maya open in front of you, even if you haven't used it very much at all, you should be able to follow along with this. I have Maya open with a brand new scene. Nothing is different here besides default, except for maybe one little aspect up here in the corner. There is this HUD showing all of the verts and the edges and the faces. All of this stuff is going to count a shape that we have selected. And to bring this up, you just go to the display menu. You go down to heads up display. And then you go down to poly count and you turn that on. All I'm going to do is create a cube. So the standard poly modeling shelf is usually what's up here first. And here I'm going to just choose the cube, which is the second from the left there. It's going to create a cube way teeny tiny in the middle of this perspective viewport. And I'm just going to use some simple commands here. I'm going to use the scroll wheel on my 3-button mouse to just scroll in. And when we look at this, we see that sort of typical shape I was talking about. We have these faces, one on each side of this cube. And if I click off to the side, somewhere in the blank area, not on the cube itself, we will deselect it and see something kind of odd. So at first, you'll look at this and probably still be thinking of a cube because we had those nice lines outlining it. But now, if you look very carefully at just this segment of the cube, you'll see there is no difference in the lighting on those two surfaces, and we have this very artificial look. You rarely see anything like that in real life. We expect a couple of different things here. For one, the lighting should dictate that these surfaces have slightly different values, right? And instead, these are exactly the same. Kind of a computer thing that can be set up, but you rarely see that in real life. Also, there's something really important. Look around the room you're in right now. Just take a peek around and look at all the edges of surfaces. Maybe a table, maybe the monitor or a keyboard, anything. Look at the edges where the corners change direction really fast. You probably are seeing a nice highlight there. And the reason that happens is because that curve has light bouncing off of it in all sorts of different directions. And one of the places where the light hits that curve bounces right into your eye, and you get a nice highlight that directly reflects from the light in the room. And if you look at the model we have here, nothing, right? There's no nice bright line in those highlights. So what we'd like to do is make that top edge, actually all these sharp edges, have a little bit of a curve to them. And if we were going to do that with polygons, there's some issues we're going to run into. I just clicked on the shape again, and there are some tools we can use to try to make curved edges, and we'll do a little bit of practice with that real quick. I'm going to go over to, actually, I'm going to go up on this same bar across here. There are some tools over here that we can use, and one of them looks like this. It has these 3 edges being shown, and this tool is the bevel tool. When I click on this, we'll get some pretty dramatic action happening here. And if I was to bring this fraction number lower, I was dragging on it, but we'll just type this in. We'll go to about 0.05. We're going to end up with a bevel like this, and it looks a little better, but it still has these very flat edges, which don't seem quite realistic. So I could increase the segments. Let's do something like 2. That's a little better. And maybe we could go up to something like 5 to make that a little bit more realistic. And if I was to click on the object, we could see all the details that we've added. I'm going to zoom in a little bit further, and you can see it looks pretty good. Looks pretty smooth. If I was to click off of it, we can see the reflections here, and that's nice. So this kind of gives us the effect we need, but we have an unfortunate side effect. Now, when I want to make changes to this cube, I have quite a bit of detail happening, right? I have many, many little surfaces here that I'll have to move around. And when I select and move and change things, if I wanted to add a curve along here, maybe make it have a little bit of a pit on the top or do some sort of a different shape, I'm going to run into some issues because I just have so many more little pieces of things to work with. So if I was to right click on the window somewhere and switch to vertex, so this is a marking menu if you've never used it before. It's actually pretty simple. When you hold down the right mouse button, you can move your pointer over to the area that you want to select. In this case, I want to select vertex. And once I do that, we'll see all the different points that I'm talking about. All these little vertices, right? If I was to select this entire, I just zoomed out, and I'm going to make a square, a marquee selection around the whole thing by starting in the empty area and selecting all around it. We'll see the number of vertices and edges. Here's the vertices I just selected here, 216 that we created. So if I want to make changes, it just makes things more complicated. So obviously I'm headed somewhere with this, right? We're going to talk about subdivision surfaces and how they help us. So I could probably just start a brand new project. Let me just go to File, New Scene. We won't save this one, and I'll create a cube again. We're going to take a slightly different approach this time, and at first it might seem a little more difficult, but it's going to give us a tremendous amount of control and give us just what we want. So again, I want to get those edges to be a little bit curved, even if it's very tight to the cube, and we're going to do it this time by adding edge loops around the surfaces. And we're going to do this in a very simple way, and I'm going to right click. I'm going to switch to edge. Edge represents these lines that go between all those vertices, those single points. So now I'm going to click on the multi-cut tool up here. It looks kind of like an X-Acto knife maybe. And I'm going to click on this. And you can see as you move your pointer around this, we have all sorts of things going on. We're allowed to put points on these surfaces and drag lines around, but I'm going to do something extra here. I'm going to hold down the Control key, and we'll get these edge loops that are trying to be created, and they're perpendicular to the line that you point to. So as I do this, I'm going to be able to add edge loops, and I can get pretty close to this edge here. And when I click here, you'll see that I've added a line near the edge. And you're going to say this isn't too much different from beveling, and that's basically true, but I'm going to keep going. Notice that I'm going along the vertical line here to get this one. And now I'm going to go along this left edge to get this edge loop. It almost looks like a picture of a little cube here on the corner. Now, it doesn't seem like much has happened yet. It really has not changed anything. If I was to, I'm going to press Q to go to select mode, by the way, to get me out of the multi-cut tool. And then I'm going to right click and choose object mode. And then I'm going to click in the background so I can see this unselected. And now at this point, we have the same exact thing. So nothing's been fixed. But we're going to do a little magic here. We're going to click on this shape, and we're going to use the subdivision surface. Actually, it's called we're going to change the view to show a smooth subdivided view. So I'm going to use the number keys across the top of my keyboard and hit 3. And something dramatic just happened, right? And I want to point out a couple of things. One, I'm going to click off to the side so it's no longer selected and we can look at it. I'm going to use the Alt key to sort of carefully drag this around to see different angles. And wow, it's a very interesting shape. We have a curved bottom on some sides, but we do have that nice squared off corner. So the reason this happened is because I have subdivided, or I've continually smoothed this shape according to the edges and faces I've created, and we've got this result. Now, I want to point something out. If I zoom in, it's a nice smooth curve there. It's very similar to what we did when we used the bezel. And if I click on this, you may notice something. There are very many verts, and there are very many edges and faces and tris and UVs. All these numbers are pretty high. But now press the 1 key on your keyboard, and we go back to the mode just showing the regular old polygons that I started with. So if you look back at those numbers again, you'll see the verts going back down to 26, edges 48. In other words, we have gone back to a simpler shape. In fact, if I right click and switch to the vertices again, this corner now only has if I'm lucky enough to get the right ones, it only has 6 different vertices, right? Actually 7. And when we're looking at these, compared to what we had before, that's so many fewer than we had. So this is great. This allows us to work with less geometry and get the result we want. Again, I press 3, and I can see what it looks like if it's smoothed or subdivided. So just to understand this a little bit better, I'm going to click on 1 again, right-click and choose Edges. I'm going to double-click on one of my edge loops. So in other words, if I double-click on an edge, it will select all the way around. So what I've done here is I've gotten that loop all the way around. I'm going to tap the W key, which allows me to move this. So, and then you can use that little arrow to move it up and down. And I'm going to move pretty fast at this point. When I drag up and down, we see nothing happening, right? Nothing's happening. But if I press 3, we can see that the top edge is actually rounding off more and more depending on how low I put this edge. And this is the interesting part, and the part that you have to get a little bit of a skill in understanding, is how does the subdivision work? Let me give you a little insight into that. There's another tool up here. It looks like this white set of 4 blocks. It looks turning into a much more complicated grid. This is the smooth tool. And if I right click on my object and switch back to object mode, and I hit the smooth tool, we'll get to see something very similar to what happened with my subdivision pressing 3, except I've actually increased the geometry now. And I can either keep clicking this button or just increase the divisions here, and you can see the shape is exactly what it looked like before. This is the very highly detailed version though, and now I don't have the advantages that I had before, right? Now look at all those vertices all over the place. If I want to make a change to this, it's going to get pretty complicated pretty fast. That process of subdividing is what makes it seem smooth. So I'm going to undo actually, Control Z, Control Z, Control Z, Control Z, Control Z. We'll go back. I'm going to switch to edge mode first. I'm going to bring this edge back up. I switched, and then let's just talk about what I was saying before. If I wanted to make this into a more complicated shape, having less vertices to work with is really handy. So I'm going to switch to vertex mode. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. I'm going to grab these vertices on the edge, and I'm just going to drag them out. Probably could have done that before. But then I would like to add some detail to this by switching to my multi-cut tool, putting something somewhere near the middle. I'm going to switch back to my vertices again, and I'm just going to select these top vertices. I'm going to press Q to get there. I'm going to use my move tool and move them down. And when you see that sort of angular divot, try to imagine what would happen if we did the smooth tool, right? And you don't have to imagine for long though, because you could just hit the 3 key and find out. And notice that I've made myself a curve here, right? So all of a sudden I have actually a pretty interesting shape. It's squared off on one side, it's curved and rounded on the other, and I could keep going and going and going with this. We can get these kind of smoother shapes out of starting with something so angular and simple. I'm going to show you what happens when we smooth this or subdivide it. Watch. I'm going to do an entire object. You can see it step by step. So the first step, you'll see everything get divided up. It looks like it kind of all doubles the number of polygons everywhere. Watch. Right? But as it does it, it averages between where they were, and you get these smooth curves where there once were not smooth curves. The reason that these sharp edges are here is because when you average and add polygons between the two edges that are close to each other, you're adding detail there, and you end up with a tighter curve or a sharper edge. But over here, where I didn't do that on this edge, right, we end up with a curve instead, because we only had the edge on top, the edge on the bottom, and it's basically averaging between those. So this is subdivision surfaces. We'll keep going. Smooth, smooth, and we end up with a very interesting, smooth shape. Doesn't look like really that it was made in a 3D modeler so much, and looks more like a soft curved surface you might see on maybe a Pixar character or a Disney character or any CG animated character. So there you go. That's all I really wanted to show you, and I hope you got something out of that. Yeah, take care, and I'll see you in another video.